What's up everybody, I'm Tony, and I am so happy to have you here today because you're about to watch the video I wish I would have had when I didn't know anything about music, when I was just first starting to get into music, and even a couple of months ago I would have found this to be insanely helpful just to have all of the information easy to understand and all in one place. I am going to tell you exactly everything you need to know first about music theory and everything you need to understand what notes, chords, scales, and keys are. And most importantly, we'll talk about how to fit all of this together in a way that the music that we listen to often will start to make a lot more sense. And we'll be able to see that each song is not this individual thing, but just a part of an underlying concept and everything connects together. By the end of this, you'll even be able to start writing your own songs or composing your own song if you wanted to give it a try. So this concept that I'm talking about that helps us tie everything together and make sense of a lot of things is the major scale. The major scale is a concept that's really important to understand because it's the backbone of the music that we listen to the most, and we'll talk about everything you need to know about it. But first, let's play a song. You might or might not know this already, but a lot of the songs that we listen to often are just a sequence of chords played in a loop, and that repeated over and over again, and that's the entire song. And if you're wondering what a chord is, it's just a group of notes played together, and it's usually 3 or more notes. For example, here's a C chord. An important thing to know about chords though, is that they have what's called the root note. This is the note that names the chord, and the rest of the notes are just notes that are tied strongly together to this root note, and when they're played along with the root note, they make it stand out. So if we're playing that C chord, we're just playing the C and the other notes that make it stand out. So now let's try it with the guitar. Okay, so if I'm telling you that a song is just a sequence of chords, and a chord is just a main note played along with other notes that make it stand out, the simplest way to play a song would be to just play that main note instead of the chords. So I'm going to play Here I Am by Soja, and I'm not going to play the chords, I'm just going to play the root notes of each chord. And this is what it would sound like. Now that sounds a little boring, let's just try adding in some rhythm. Now a melody. She calls me when I'm in town. I pretend I'm not around, but she sees on the screen I am. Here I am, here I am. Okay, so that's now starting to sound a little better, and it would sound even better if we were to add the full chords to that song. But how exactly do we know what chords to add, and how do we know that they fit well together? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to finish by playing the song with the full chords. That takes us to the first thing we need to talk about, and that is notes. The first thing we need to know is that there are only 12 notes. That's it. That's all there is to the music that we're used to listening to, and that's music that we can play with a piano or anything you can play with a guitar. From classical music to popular music, it's all within 12 notes. Okay, so what are those 12 notes exactly? They go from A to G, and in music things tend to revolve around C. So we'll start with C. These are called natural notes. And then there are also some notes that are between the natural notes, and their names depend on the notes they have right next to them. If they're named by raising the lower note, they're called sharps. And if they're named by lowering the higher note, they're called flats. But these two are exactly the same note, and using one name or the other will just depend on the context. And in this video, we'll mostly refer to them as sharps. It's really easy to visualize this in a piano, where the 12 notes just repeat over and over again, and all white notes are natural notes, and the black notes are the accidentals. As you can see, if we go up one note from C, we get to C sharp. But we could also call this D flat if we wanted to. We can also see easily in a piano how notes start over every 12 keys. It's just that whenever you start over, you're at what's called an octave higher. What happens here is that if you had a string tuned to a certain note, say C, if you played that string, you would be playing that note. And then, if you split that string exactly in half, and you played it, it would produce the same exact note, but exactly an octave higher, and the frequency would be exactly double. This is basically how a guitar works. You press frets to change the length of the string you're playing. If you grab the 6th string, for example, which is tuned to E, and press the 12th fret, this would split the string exactly in half, and we would be playing an E, the same exact note as the open string, just at an octave higher. And then all of the frets in between would be the rest of the notes, and after this middle E, notes just repeat over and over again, just like with a piano. A great way to remember all of the notes is just by picturing a piano. All of the white notes are naturals, and all of the black notes are accidentals. Probably the most important thing to remember here, apart from the actual notes, is that these are exactly the same distance away from each other, even though it doesn't look like it in a piano. So when we start at one note and go up by one, we get to the next one. If we go up by 3, we would get here, and if we go up by 2, we would get here, and so on. They're exactly the same distance away from each other. Okay, so now we have all of these notes, but how do we use them to create music? We need to find a way to group these notes together in a way that makes sense. And then these groups of notes we can suddenly start to use to create music. That's where scales come in. And probably the most important one to learn first, because then the rest and pretty much everything else starts to build on top of this, is the major scale. Mastering the major scale is like having a superpower when it comes to music, because it's the backbone of the music that we usually listen to. And by that I mean Western music in general. And once you know how the major scale works, so many other things are just variations from what we get when we learn the major scale. And you might be thinking, okay, but what is a scale in the first place? We can think of a scale as some sort of map, or set of directions that tells you exactly where to go based on where you are. And in the same way that if you had a map, but you don't know where you are in the map, you can't use it. And if you know where you are, but you don't have a map or set of directions, you don't know where to go. And that you need both the map and the reference point. When using a scale, you also need the scale and the reference point to be able to use it. And this reference point is what ties strongly together to the concept of what a key is in music. Okay, so let me start by telling you that the major scale of the note C is all of the white notes in the piano. This means that the C major scale has the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and then back to C again. This one's the easiest one to remember because it's just the white notes in the piano. Okay, so now I ask you, what set of directions do we need to get all of these notes if we started at the note C? Well, we see that to get from C to D, we need to go from C and add 2, and that would take us to D. Then from D to E, we need to go from D and add 2. Then we add 1, then 2, then 2, then 2, and finally 1 again to get back to C. So we could say that the major scale is defined by this set of directions: +2, +2, +1, +2, +2, +2, +1. In music, we call the difference between two notes an interval. And the two smallest intervals are +1s and +2s, which are called semitones or half steps, and tones or whole steps. So with this, we can see that the major scale can be defined by this set of directions, where W represents a whole step and H represents a half step. We can see that when we apply this to C, we get the C major scale. An easier way to visualize this is with a line that looks like this, where you have the longer and shorter distances representing whole steps and half steps. And an even easier way to look at it is by turning this line into a circle, since we know that the pattern just repeats over and over again. And now this is where things start to click, because now we could create this sort of tool that would help us to get every single major scale for every single note that we wanted. So we see that when we use C as a reference, we get the C major scale. Okay, so all of this for what? Why is this useful, and why do we want to get the major scale for every single note? Well, now we can start to create our own melodies with those scales. See? And now if you start to pay attention to the songs that you listen to, they most likely use the major scale. Great, so now we know that we could use the major scale to get notes. But maybe an even more practical way to use it is to get the major chords. Because getting a major chord is as easy as getting the first, the third, and the fifth note from the major scale, and playing these notes together. So if we grab our major scale and just added a mark for the first, third, and fifth note, we can just get all our major chords for any note that we wanted to. An easier way to get the major chords without having to write out the scale is by looking at the spaces that you leave between the notes that you need to play. And what do I mean by this? When you play a major chord, you want to make sure that you're leaving 3 notes in between the first 2 notes that you play, and then leave 2 notes in between the second and the third note that you play. When we play a C major chord, we see that we leave those spaces in between. And if we wanted to play a D chord, for example, the same would happen. And the same for an E chord, and so on. The same way that we call the +1 a semitone or a half step, and we call the +2 a tone or a whole step, we call the +4 a major third because it takes you to the third note of the major scale, and we call a +3 a minor third because it takes you to the third note of the minor scale, which is just the major scale looked at from a different angle, and I'll explain that in just a second. Another useful interval to know is the +7, which is called the perfect fifth. So a major chord is built with the root note, its major third, and a minor third from the second note, which we can also call a perfect fifth from the root note, or the root note +7. And by the way, to write major chords, we just write the note of the chord by itself. So if you see a note by itself that refers to a chord, you just assume it's referring to a major chord. So if you see a C, that's a C major chord. An A, that's an A major chord. An F sharp, that's an F sharp major chord, and so on. So now we understand the major scale a little better. There's another scale that's really important to understand too, and that's the minor scale. But don't worry, the minor scale is literally the same as the major scale, just that you start from a different reference point. And what exactly do I mean by this? If we take the major scale and start it from here, we get the minor scale. And looking at our major scale here, to get the minor scale, we just use this different reference point. And that's it, we now have our minor scale for every single note that we want. And the same way that we use the major scale to build major chords, to build a minor chord, you just do the same thing with the minor scale. So pick the first, third, and fifth note of the minor scale. So if we compare the 2 scales to each other, we see that if we take the first, third, and fifth note of each scale, the only difference between the chords is that to get the minor chord, we just slide the major third down by a note, which turns it into a minor third from the root. In other words, to build a minor chord, we take the root note, its minor third, and its perfect fifth. And in a piano, we would visualize this like this. We just take our major chord and move the middle note down by 1 and get the minor chord. And now we see how the notes in between switch over, leaving now 2 notes between the first 2 notes and 3 notes between the second and third. To write minor chords, we write the note of the chord with a lowercase m right next to it. This denotes what's called the quality of the chord, if it's major or minor. And if you don't see anything right next to the note, again, just assume it's a major chord. Okay, by this point you probably noticed that if we're using the same sort of map to map out each scale, we're actually getting the same exact notes for 2 different scales. Because if we look at the C major scale, we're also looking at the A minor scale. And that's exactly right. Every major scale has its relative minor, and the other way around. And these scales share exactly the same notes. And you might be thinking, okay, but if they use exactly the same notes, wouldn't they result in exactly the same songs? Well, that's not necessarily the case, because when you use each scale, you would emphasize or tend towards some notes that are different between each other. For example, the note that sounds the most like home and that resolves any tension in the songs that you write is going to be the first note in each scale, which is different for the 2. And this, along with many other distinctions, would make the songs sound a lot differently. Okay, but now you should give yourself a pat in the back for coming this far, and now you know how to build 24 different chords. All major chords and all minor chords, and that's actually a lot. Because it is with these chords that we can play the simplified version of pretty much every single song out there. And what do I mean by this? that whenever you look up the chords of a song that you want to play and all of a sudden you find yourself with slightly more complicated chords than the ones that you already know, the major and the minor chords, say that you find yourself with this chord or this chord. Well, if this happens, you can just simplify these chords to their core version of the chord, which would be A minor or D major. As long as you're playing the right quality of the chord or the right tonality of the chord, which is major or minor, you should be good. And maybe focus on learning these more complicated versions of chords after you master the major and minor chords. In a lot of cases, it just involves playing an additional note or slightly changing the chords that you already know. But wow, you've made it this far and past the most complicated stuff for today. The last thing that's left is getting that final piece of the puzzle that makes this all fit together and gets you to actually start creating music. Well, let's start by saying that we wanted to write a song that's in the key of C major. That means that we can use the notes that are in the C major scale. But what about the chords? You might be thinking, let's just get every single note in the major scale and just get the major chord for each note. And that's actually a great assumption. So let's say we get a C major chord. This chord fits perfectly in the notes of the scale. But what if we get to D major, for example? That chord is made with D, F sharp, and A. And F sharp is not in this scale. So to write a song, we would actually want to create the chords out of the scale that we get. So we want the chords to be a result of the scale that we're looking at. So what we do to get the chords is that we pick the first, the third, and the fifth note from the scale as if we started from each note in that scale. So to show you what I mean by this, it's way easier to see it in the piano. So we have all of these notes in the C major scale, and then back to C. We want to pick 3 consecutive notes from the note in this scale, while leaving 1 note of separation like this. Okay, so what do we get when we look at C? That's right, we just get a C major chord. But what happens when we look at D? From the spaces between the notes, we see that we actually get a D minor chord. And if we do this for the rest of the notes, we would get E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and when we get to B, something interesting happens. We no longer have the difference of 3 notes in between and then 2, or 2 notes in between and then 3, as would happen for a major and minor chord. Instead, we have a separation of 2 notes and then also 2 notes. We call this type of chord a diminished chord because it involves a minor third from the root note and a diminished fifth, which is just a perfect fifth moved down by a semitone, or a +6 instead of a +7. Don't worry about this type of chord right now, because it's not used that often and you can learn it later on. So then if you see the scale in terms of chords, these are the ones we could use to write a song. And the general version of this is that when we're using the major scale, you know that the 1 chord will always be a major, the 2 chord will always be a minor, then the 3 a minor, 4 major, 5 major, 6 minor, and 7 diminished, which you won't find that much. So any song that you wanted to write in a major tonality, you could use these chords. And what if you wanted to use a minor tonality? Well, since we know they're exactly the same but looked at from a different angle, we would just rearrange the chords and would get that the first chord is minor, the second diminished, and so on. And that's it. And that's all you need to start understanding how songs are built. And you could even start composing your own. Just pick a key, pick a tonality, and now you know what notes you can use, you know what chords you can use, and just get creative. Start finding chord progressions that you like and start writing your own melodies on top of it, or start singing on top of it and see where it takes you. For now, let's do an example. Let's say that we want to write a song in the key of A minor. Remember, A minor is as if we picked C major, but in here we'll treat A minor as a home chord as opposed to C major. So I messed around with the chords in the key, and the chords I liked ended up being a 1, 7, 5, 6 progression. And it sounds something like this. So there you go, that's an example of a chord progression in A minor. If we wanted, we could start creating melodies and adding things on top of it, but that's already essentially a song. If you start to get familiarized with all of these concepts that we talked about, it'll feel like a superpower. If you're playing with someone and they suddenly say like, hey, let's play a song, it's in the key of B minor, and it's going to be a 1, 6, 3, 7 progression. And then you would just pick those chords out of the chords that you could use with the B minor scale. And guess what is one of the thousands of songs that uses that progression? Here I Am by Soja. So let's give it a try. She calls me when I'm in town. I pretend I'm not around. She sees on the screen I am. Here I am, here I am. She don't call me one and only, no. She just calls me when she gets lonely, and something I do that gets her there. Feel better and get well. She don't call me when I'm in town, 'cause I pretend I'm not around. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you all so much for watching and staying with me till the end. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you could learn anything from it. I certainly would have appreciated this a lot back then when I was trying to get some valuable information out there, because I certainly learned a lot of things in the wrong order. And I just hope you find this valuable and you can see that if you break things down step by step, they're easy to understand. So I truly hope you found this helpful. And if that's the case, please smash that like button, comment anything that you thought below, and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in seeing more, because that would go a long way for me. And also, if you don't want to miss any content, hit that bell button so you get notified whenever I upload anything new. But until then, I'll see you all soon.